All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're going to break down a really fascinating piece of real-world economics, the UK's soft drinks levy, which pretty much everyone calls the sugar tax. We're going to look at the theory behind it, the arguments for and against, and most importantly, what actually happened.
So just imagine for a second, you've got a country facing a pretty serious obesity crisis, especially with kids. The costs are just going up, and the future health of the population is, well, not looking great. What's the first solution that pops into your head? You're probably thinking about things like public health ads, maybe new programs in schools, but the UK government reached for a completely different tool, one that comes straight out of an economics textbook. They decided to fight a health problem with economic theory. And yeah, this is where it gets really interesting.
Okay, so to understand why they did this, you first have to see the problem through an economist's eyes. And when an economist looks at the situation, they don't just see a health issue. They see a classic case of market failure. The key idea here is something called a negative externality. So what does that mean? Well, it's when a simple transaction, like you buying a can of soda, creates a sort of spillover cost for people who weren't involved at all. In this case, society as a whole. And those extra costs, they're not included in the price you pay at the checkout.
And just how big are those costs? Well, get this. In the UK, the annual cost of obesity was estimated at a mind-boggling £47 billion. And that's not just about one person's health. We're talking about the massive strain on the National Health Service and all the lost productivity when people are off work sick. These are huge society-wide costs.
So you've got this double whammy of market failure going on. First, those negative externalities we just talked about. But there's a second problem, imperfect information. Let's be honest, a lot of consumers, especially younger ones, might not fully understand the long-term health risks. That immediate sugary hit feels a lot more real than a potential problem decades down the line. The result of all this, the market left to its own devices, leads to way too much consumption and an overall loss of well-being for society.
So if the market's broken, how does an economist try to fix it? Well, the textbook answer is an indirect tax. So let's pull out the classic model and see how this is supposed to work in theory. Now, if you're an economics student, this diagram should be very familiar. This is your standard supply and demand model, and it's basically the blueprint for how the sugar tax was designed. Let's walk through exactly what's going on here.
Okay, let's break it down. Step 1, the tax gets slapped on the producers. This makes it more expensive for them to make the drinks, which shifts the whole supply curve inwards or up from S to S plus tax. That shift forces a new balance point in the market. The price for you, the consumer, goes up from P1 to P2. And as the law of demand tells us, when price goes up, the quantity people buy goes down from Q1 to Q2. And at the same time, you see that shaded box? That's the new revenue the government collects from the tax.
But here's the really clever part, the core principle of the whole thing. The tax forces the market, both producers and consumers, to finally acknowledge those hidden social costs we talked about. By making the drink more expensive, the price starts to reflect its true cost to society. The fancy economic term for this is that the tax internalizes the externality. It's all about making the price tell the truth. Of course, taking a theory from a textbook and dropping it into the real world is never that clean. Before this tax was even rolled out, a massive debate kicked off, with some really strong economic arguments on both sides of the fence.
On one hand, supporters argue to internalize that externality, raise some much-needed cash for things like school sports, and this is a big one, give manufacturers a huge push to change their recipes to avoid the tax. But on the other hand, critics were worried. They said demand for these drinks might be inelastic, meaning a price hike wouldn't really stop people from buying them. They also argued it was a regressive tax that would hit low-income families the hardest, and that it could even lead to job losses.
And that point about elasticity, it's absolutely critical. Price elasticity of demand, or PED, is all about how much demand changes when the price changes. If demand is inelastic, it means people are going to buy it anyway. Maybe it's a habit or they just don't care about the price increase. If that were true, the tax would raise money, but it wouldn't actually change behavior. You could say the entire success of the policy was riding on this one concept. So we've had the theory, and we've had the debate. But this wasn't just a thought experiment. The tax was actually implemented in April 2018. And now, years later, we have the data. We can finally move from theory to hard evidence. This is it. This is the moment of truth for any economic policy. Did it actually work the way it was supposed to? Or were the critics right all along? Let's take a look at what the numbers say.
The very first number is, frankly, stunning. After the tax was announced, the amount of sugar kids consumed from soft drinks fell by roughly half, a 50% drop. I mean, that is a huge change in behavior, and it strongly suggests that demand was way more elastic, way more responsive to price than some of the critics had predicted. And this right here shows one of the most powerful effects, something that went beyond just consumer choice. A massive part of the success came from the producers themselves changing their products. To avoid paying the tax, over half of the manufacturers reformulated their drinks. They just took the sugar out. The data shows a nearly 29% drop in the average sugar content of the drinks on the shelf. The incentive worked, big time.
And if we zoom out and look at the household level, the impact is still crystal clear. On average, the amount of sugar people bought from drinks dropped by 15 grams per household every single week compared to what it would have been if the tax never happened.
Now, this is probably one of the most important slides because it directly answers that criticism about the tax being regressive and hurting the poor. The data shows the complete opposite happened. The biggest reduction in sugar purchases, and because of that, the biggest predicted health gains, were seen in the most deprived households. In terms of its health impact, the policy was actually progressive. Making this happen was not an easy political decision. And this quote from the chancellor who introduced it, George Osborne, really captures that reality. He's basically admitting there was a known market failure. We knew there was a problem, and that for a long time, the political will just wasn't there to act on it. So the big takeaway here is that the evidence is pretty clear. This economic intervention was a success. It changed behavior from both consumers and producers, and it delivered the biggest health benefits to the people who needed them most. And that leaves us with one final big question. If this economic tool worked so well for sugar, where else could we apply it to tackle some of society's other big problems?